The American Rescue Plan has the potential to be a game changer for schools. But what's in it, and how could it affect K-12 education? Let's start with the basics. The American Rescue Plan was signed by President Joe Biden on March 11th, 1 year after the declaration of the coronavirus pandemic. It includes nearly $130 billion for K-12 education. And most of that money, about 85%, is going to go to local school districts, although states will get a share too. And if you take a step back, the American Rescue Plan is one piece of a three-part strategy for the Biden administration. The second piece, the CDC guidance the administration says will help schools reopen safely. And the third piece is the administration's efforts to increase teachers' access to the coronavirus vaccine. Now let's answer three basic questions about the American Rescue Plan. Question 1. How can schools use American Rescue Plan funding? The American Rescue Plan says schools can use its funding in all kinds of different ways. Schools can use it for special education services, mental health supports, feeding meals to students, cleaning schools, providing services to English language learners, education technology, improving the air quality in schools, and planning for future long-term school closures. Be prepared, right? But there's one thing that the American Rescue Plan says that schools and states have to spend the money on, and that's learning recovery. In other words, they have to use the money to address the academic needs of students caused by the pandemic. But the law doesn't say what approaches schools and states have to use when it comes to learning recovery. That means that schools could ultimately decide to use the money for things like intensive tutoring, summer school, and extended learning programs. So the answers for how the money will be used for learning recovery could vary quite a bit from district to district and from state to state. In addition, the American Rescue Plan has funding for student access to the internet, about $7 billion worth there. And the American Rescue Plan also has $350 billion in support for state and local governments, some of which could ultimately be used to shore up local education budgets, although right now, state budgets overall don't look too bad in many cases. Question 2. What's the timeline for using American Rescue Plan money? The American Rescue Plan says that schools have to allocate the money by the end of September 2024. Now that doesn't mean they have to spend the money by that time. It just means essentially they have to have a plan for it. Now this reflects a relatively nuanced understanding of the pandemic. On the one hand, there's a general understanding that the pandemic is an emergency, but at the same time, the timeline seems to recognize that the pandemic will have effects on students, educators, and school communities that are going to last quite a long time. And that could be the big reason why the timeline for having a plan for this money reaches into 2024. Now, states are on a bit of a tighter timeline. When they get American Rescue Plan funding for schools, they have 60 days to turn around and give districts their share of the money, and districts are entitled to at least 90% of those funds. Question 3. Will the American Rescue Plan help schools reopen? In general, yes, that's the idea. But let's go into some pieces of information that complicate that answer. Many, if not most schools, already have a plan for what they're going to do for the rest of this academic year. Recent federal data collected earlier this year indicated that a significant majority of 4th and 8th graders were not receiving full-time in-person learning. And that same data show that if you're a white student, you are much more likely to be getting full-time in-person learning than a black or brown student. So, all of that adds up to this. The American Rescue Plan is designed to not only ensure that schools reopen this academic year, but especially in the upcoming academic year, the 2021-22 school year. In addition, it's designed to ensure that schools provide summer learning and enrichment opportunities to help them in those learning recovery efforts. And the American Rescue Plan is designed to ensure that inequities in education that the pandemic has exacerbated are addressed. One more thing. In two previous coronavirus relief packages, public schools received about $67 billion. So, when you add up all three coronavirus relief packages over the past year, schools have received nearly $200 billion. That's nearly twice what they got in the 2009 stimulus package backed by President Barack Obama. So, schools are getting a lot of money to address the coronavirus pandemic, and correspondingly, expectations will be very high that they will use the money wisely.